Oh, moo! I'm Coco the Confident Cow, and I wasn't expecting any guests today. Well, since you're here and want to play some of my games back there, I guess boot up the NES and, oh shoot. I just remembered I'm missing some cables. It's fine, we'll just emulate it. How? Oh, well, I hope you've got about a half an hour to spare. Now, these consoles on display right here are what I grew up with in my childhood. From the NES, to the DS, to the PS2, even down to the friggin' Wii U. And while I still own every one of these consoles, hooking them up to my PC to stream retro gaming would be a huge hassle. Some consoles I'm missing cables for, some have busted hinges, some can only play when plugged in, and some games I only own digitally with shut down storefronts. Even if the stars aligned and I have all of the right cables and all of the right tools to hook it up to stream, the amount of hassle of switching consoles on the reg would be unfathomable. I'm not going to spend 30 minutes to hook up my Super Nintendo to play Super Mario World, then put it away to hook up the Wii and set up the motion bar to get Super Mario Galaxy all working. I could keep them all plugged in, but I think that might be a fire hazard. Now, the easiest solution is to buy the officially released ROMs and re-releases that companies put out, but that's not always an option. And sometimes they either charge up the ass for 15-year-old games, fail at making quality emulation, or just plain stuck on old consoles. Even if I pay Nintendo 50 bones a year, I still can't play Super Smash Bros. Even though I own it on the N64 and I bought it on the Wii. Listen, I'm not spending $60 on Donkey Kong Country Returns, a game that cost me $50 15 years ago and $40 10 years ago, that I can make look just as good using emulation. And that's just the Nintendo side of things. Sony's not much better. I can't even play the original God of War games. You know, Sony's flagship franchise. But don't worry, I can lick Aqua's titties for $2. Wow, this whole time I was getting it on the internet for free. Microsoft is a lot better in this regard, but I still haven't forgotten what happened to the Master Chief Collection. And the other big publishers? Well, I don't even want to think about how Rockstar handles their ports. So, what's my other option? Emulation. Emulation is the process of copying the behavior of one computer system onto another computer system. There's hardware emulation, which emulates a system using actual physical hardware, and software emulation, which does it through software you can put on your system. Hardware emulation is stuff like FPGAs or clone consoles which have hardware built into it to run the games as accurately as possible. And then there's software emulation, which can come in like a dozen different ways, from something as simple as using your computer or phone, to buying dedicated retro handhelds or Raspberry Pis, and so much more. Heck, if you ever buy one of those retro collections like the Megaman collection, they're just emulating it. Emulation is awesome. With it, you can do more than just play the games you can't play anymore. You can run hacks, upscale the resolution, add your own filters. The amount you can do is endless. Golden Corral gives us endless food. It doesn't mean it's good. Yeah, emulation ain't all sunshine and rainbows. Finding the right emulators, setting up the right controls, and backing up your own games can be a hassle. But despite all that effort, it was worth it. I could play any game that I already own, all in one place. But see, that's just the surface. I didn't want to just play my old games. I wanted to play retro games in the most authentic way possible, short of playing it on real hardware. It took a long time to get everything working just right, but I'll show you my setup and a little bit of the process of how I got there. This video isn't going to be a tutorial or anything, there's lots of other videos out there for that, but I wanted to show you how I strived to play games the most authentic way possible. It was a nightmare. Emulation can be done on almost anything nowadays. PC, Mac, Linux, Android, iOS, Switch, and even older consoles like the Wii, Xbox, DS, and Dreamcast can be hacked to emulate games. I've done them all. And even though I am mostly a PC gamer nowadays, I decided to get myself a dedicated emulation device that can do it all. One that I can use on stream, one that I can plug into my TV, and one that I can even play in bed. I got myself a retro handheld. There's hundreds of these devices, and they've been around for a while. They can vary in price and quality, and it's essentially its own hobby. I could easily make an entire video just on retro handhelds. But for now, here's the gist. You can get these super budget ones that are like $30 that can play games all the way up to N64. You've got ones that are faithful recreations of old consoles, And then you've got the really high tier stuff like the Odin 2 Portal or the A&O Pocket Ace that can emulate basically anything, including Switch and PC. They can cost upwards of like $600. Sheesh. This is a crazy hobby with people buying dozens of devices at a time. Where are they getting the money for this stuff? I really gotta open up an OnlyFans account. I do own a few of these retro handhelds myself, each with a specific purpose. But today I want to focus on two of the ones that I own and how I use them to emulate retro consoles. Now, to be clear, I could use my PC for this, but like I said earlier, I wanted a dedicated device for it. A sort of console that can do it all. And so my primary emulation device that I use, and the one where I'll be capturing most of my footage from, is the Metroid Pocket 5, or the RP5. This bad boy can play so many games on it. The RP5 can emulate any console from classic arcade games all the way up to the GameCube and PS2 at high resolutions, and can even play some Switch games. This handheld runs on Android, so any apps on Google Play I can just download right from the store, or others are APKs that I can sideload from GitHub. Because this runs on Android, this ironically makes this a great Balatro machine. I may play Balatro on this more than retro games sometimes. Now, to get into some of the details of how I set up my RP5, brace yourself, because I'm about to list all of the apps. To start off, I use an app called Emulation Station Desktop Edition, or ESTE, as a launcher to turn the ugly default Android interface into a more console-like experience. I even customized the theme iconic to my liking. I found and edited my own images, picking my favorite game of each console and setting them up as the console's theme. I use RetroArch to emulate all of the older consoles, from the Game Boy and NES era up to the GBA and N64. Basically, if it's older than a PS2, I'm using RetroArch. For GameCube and Wii, I use the Dolphin app. For PS2, I use Aether SX2. For DS, I use Drastic, or if I'm feeling spicy, Melon DS. And for PSP, I use PPSSPPPP. All standard stuff when it comes to Android emulation. The more modern consoles are where things get trickier. There are no apps for Xbox or 360 emulation on the App Store, and emulation on those in general are pretty rough, even if you have a high-end PC. There have been some recent strides, but if I ever want to play any games of those generations, most of the popular ones can already be purchased on my PC. I said the popular ones. PS3 emulation is fresh on the Android scene, so I can't really get much mileage out of that. Which means I'll have to use RPCS3 on my PC if I want to play Sonic 06 again. Please stop! Stop! They're still doing it! She's doing it! I think I'm in an abusive relationship with my chat. For the Wii U, Android recently got a port of the famous CMU emulator, but it's so fresh that some Wii U games don't run the best on the RP5. I'll play some games casually on here, but for streaming, I'll use the same emulator, but on my PC. More on my Wii U setup later. Since both of the main Switch emulators and the main 3DS emulator got struck down hard by Nintendo's overly rambunctious lawyers, things get trickier. For the 3DS, I used a brand new Azahar emulator, which works pretty well so far. But I think going forward, I'll be using my actual old new 3DS to play DS and 3DS games. Emulating dual screens has got too many of its own problems right now, so authentic hardware is going to be the way to go. And finally, for the Switch, there are new Switch emulators popping up every second now. But I've got myself a Switch too, so if I'm ever playing a Switch game for the first time, I'll just play them on my Switch too. After all, contrary to popular belief, emulation isn't all about piracy. I don't like to do it, and if a new game comes out, you should buy it and support it. So, more or less, that's my Metroid Pocket 5 setup. I use the RP5 to play most of my retro games on my stream, using the most popular emulators like RetroArch. If you want to know what cores and apps I use, well, here it is, it's on screen. Some cores might actually be more accurate than what I have, but at the end of the day, I hardly even notice a difference. If you got an Android phone, you can actually use any of these apps yourself, and almost all of them have PC counterparts that you can download online. Anything older than PS2, I use modern hardware like 3DS, PC, or a Switch. The Retro Pocket 5 I've got is connected to a dock, much like how the Switch works, and is hooked up to a capture card. From there, I can use any controller that works on Android, which is most Bluetooth controllers. More on controllers later. I've got a lot to talk about later, huh? Now then, let's talk about how I display these games. Remember, I'm trying to play games as authentically as possible, so I want them to look as authentically as possible. That's where things like shaders, integer scaling, filters, and overlays come in. What? Yeah, that's a lot of terms and it's very confusing. So let's start with an example. Super Mario Bros. 3, a classic, came out in the Nintendo Entertainment System, aka the NES. The NES's resolution output was an absolutely massive 256 by 240 pixels. You know what else is massive? My love for you, viewer. Aww. And this day, here's what the NES resolution looks like displayed on a 1080p resolution screen. Now let's compare it to your average 4K monitor. Pretty small, huh? For reference, 4K resolution is 3840 by 2160, which means you can fit about 150 NES screens in here. Obviously, no one wants to play a game on a screen this small, so we need to scale it up. But you can do that in a bunch of different ways. If you're a monster, you can choose to fill up the whole screen, but the game looks stretched out like wide Kylo Ren. Alternatively, you can scale it up to fit the screen from top to bottom. However, this can cause other problems. If you do this, you'll have uneven pixels. See, pixels are squares, and if you choose to fit the resolution from top to bottom, the pixels will become rectangular instead, causing some games to not look quite right. An easy example is Megaman. If you fill the game up to your screen, the health bar aren't perfect rectangles like they're supposed to be. They'll be uneven. There's two ways of fixing this. One is to use an interpolation shader, which makes the pixels look a bit more even by essentially blurring the screen. If your screen is 1080p or higher, you may not even notice the interpolation. However, there is another method that I prefer to use. So, if you want to take Super Mario Bros. 3 and up the resolution to be as big as possible to fit on screen, but not have uneven pixels, you can use something called integer scaling. You can set it to overscale on a 1080p screen, and it'll cut off some of the pixels at the top and bottom. These cut pixels usually don't matter, since most CRT TVs back then already cut these parts out, so game developers don't often put anything essential there. However, the thing about integer scale is that sometimes it doesn't always work as nicely. For example, if you overscale Game Boy games, too much of the game gets cut, so you want to underscale it instead, which means you'll get small borders at the top and bottom of the screen. So integer scale can vary between console to console and how it's displayed on your screen. And with that, finally, Mario will look exactly like he did in the 80s, but bigger. Well, almost exactly. So, Super Mario Bros. 3 came out in the 80s, and back then, TVs were a lot different. The obvious difference is resolution. We have a way higher definition screens compared to 40 years ago. But there's also a difference of aspect ratios. Most TVs in the 80s and 90s were a 4:3 aspect ratio, which means the TV was a bit squarish compared to today's TVs, which are a 16:9 ratio. At the time, 16:9 ratio was dubbed widescreen TVs. Alright, so we're gonna display Super Mario Bros. 3 in a 4:3 aspect ratio, right? Whoa! You thought this was gonna be simple? This is emulation we're talking about! Nothing is simple. Now, remember how I said the NES's resolution was 256 by 240? Well, the aspect ratio for that is actually 8:7, which is almost a perfect square. Huh, that's strange. The game's aspect ratio is 8:7, but the TVs back then were 4:3. So games were actually stretched wide from 8:7 to 4:3. Weird, huh? Many games were made with 4:3 in mind. So, for example, the Triforce in Zelda Link to the Past looks perfect in 4:3. But in 8:7 it looks a little bit squished. However, many circles look correct in 8:7, but look stretched in 4:3. There is a whole debate on which aspect ratio is correct to emulate, and truth be told, there's no right answer here. Personally, since NES games were meant to be displayed on a 4:3 TV, I emulate them to be 4:3. Remember, my whole goal is to play games as authentically as possible. So for game consoles like NES, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, I do a 4:3 integer scale. So, we got the resolution right, and the aspect ratio right. Now it looks exactly how it did in the 80s, right? Wrong. See, technology was vastly different back then, and the TVs that were used to play these dusty old consoles were using cathode ray tube technology, aka CRTs. CRTs have a distinct look to them, and sadly, no one makes CRTs anymore. If you want one, you have to get it used or refurbished, and I'm honestly surprised no modern company makes them anymore. After all, they still make cassette players and vinyl records. I always wanted my music to sound worse. Anyway, if you want your games to look like a CRT TV, then that means we'll need to utilize something called shaders. There's tons of them. Remember earlier how I mentioned you can use an interpolation shader to make the pixels even? Well, you can use shaders to do way more than just that. You can also use it to mimic other displays, like a monitor, old LCDs, or in this case, a CRT. Now, I did lots of Googling and researching, and there really is no best CRT shader, since the quality of a CRT can look different from manufacturer to manufacturer. Recently, there's one you can download called CRT Beam Simulator that's supposed to mimic CRTs down to the individual lines. It's incredible, but also a pain in the ass since it requires a specific refresh rate. While most monitors and TVs today have a 60 Hz refresh rate, 120 Hz is the minimum requirement for this shader. What makes it inconvenient is that it has to be 120 Hz, or something divisible by it like 240 Hz, 360, etc, etc. So, my monitor has a refresh rate of 144 Hz, and it's incompatible. Now, I can change the refresh rate of my monitor to go to 120 to use the shader. You know how much of a hassle it is to constantly switch frame rates? Besides, my RB5 only has a 60 Hz screen and can only output as much. So, the shader I ended up with was Retro Crisis Shaders. This guy's work is magical. He has them for most retro consoles, and when I first installed his SNES CRT shader, I legit teared up. Pussy. This is exactly how I remember Mario looking like as a child. So, I use all his shaders for any games played on the TV. And now, finally, we have Super Mario Bros. 3 looking as authentically as possible. There's a whole debate on whether games look better or worse using CRT filters, and I'm not here to judge. To be honest, for almost my entire life of emulating old consoles, I never used them. I always thought they looked blurry and ugly and just get in the way. But after finding certain shaders that I find appealing, I've grown to love them. If you don't like them, well, you're wrong. Just kidding. Totally understand. I do think some games benefit from the CRT look though, in particular the Donkey Kong Country games. The CRT effect makes the 3D pixels look way more 3D. But sometimes those big chunky pixels are nice to look at too. Now, speaking of nice things to look at.
Not.
So using all the above methods, this is how I make NES, SNES, and Genesis games look as authentically as possible. Now, what about the portable consoles, like the Game Boy? Well, things are a bit more complicated here. I still do integer scaling to maintain that pixel balance, but this time I keep the original aspect ratio of 10:9, which was the aspect ratio of the Game Boy. Now for the colors, which makes things a bit more complicated. There's 3 different Game Boys. There's the Game Boy Pocket, and the Game Boy Color. There's also the Game Boy Light that released in Japan, but we're not gonna talk about it. All of the different Game Boys have different colored screens. So if you were to load up a Game Boy ROM on an emulator, what you'll normally get is actually a game that's all in black and white. And that's because games were actually made this way. That green color you often see in old school Game Boys is from the screen itself, not the game. But a Game Boy Color screen was different. If you put a Game Boy game into a Game Boy Color, you can actually choose what color combination you want by hitting the D-pad or buttons. As a kid, I always liked the black and white one. Now, growing up, I had a Game Boy Pocket. My brothers had the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color, but when I played Pokemon, Tetris, and Metroid 2, the colors from the Pocket are what I'm used to seeing. So, in the emulation settings, I choose to make them look like a Game Boy Pocket. Personally, I think they're much easier on the eyes than the blaring bright green. I don't think I'll be seeing any other color for a while. Now for the display. Game Boys obviously didn't use CRT technology, so the same shaders I used before won't apply here. Game Boys used LCDs. Very, very old LCDs. They had a dot matrix display, and to mimic this, I use a shader that mimics the dots on the screen. Now, if you want to display the game even more authentically, you can choose to mimic screen ghosting. Remember, this display is from the prehistoric times, and it wasn't great, so there was a ghosting effect. Also, one thing I learned while writing this part of the script, the Game Boy Pocket's LCD screen mostly eliminated the ghosting, which explains a lot, because I don't remember games looking this shitty. Sometimes I'll use simple preset, which has a mild ghosting effect, and that's because some games use the ghosting effect for transparency's sake. I think this is a nice compromise between actual ghosting and not making your head explode. The GBA also has its own screen differences. Similarly, I use an LCD shader to give it that effect, but one thing to consider with the GBA is that the screen was very dim. To compensate for this, most GBA games are overly vibrant. Colors are bright, so that way the screen could look a little less dim. This, however, has a knock-on effect, which by emulating it, all the games look super bright. An easy way to showcase this is by comparing the original SNES Mario games to their GBA counterparts. You can have a shader that mimics the GBA's original display, or you can change it in emulation settings. Another way to make the game look shitty. There's lots of these, huh? Personally, I think this looks awful. I've emulated GBA games for so long that this bright, vibrant look is what I'm used to. So yeah, I keep that off. But Coco! What about emulating games as authentically as possible? Well, my sexy inquisitive viewer, growing up my brother had a Game Boy Advance SP, which had a backlit screen, which means games never looked this dark to me. They've always looked bright and colorful. So I kept that color correction setting off, so it's authentic to my experience. Game Boy Color emulators similarly also have a color correction option with varying degrees. I personally like to select fast as a way to make the colors more accurate without desaturating them so much. I think it's a nice middle ground between what the games originally looked like and what games look like now. After all, having LCD shaders layered on top of the screen already dim the screen, so color correcting it too much will make the colors look washed out. And now the word color doesn't sound like a real word anymore. One thing you may have noticed for the Game Boy games on screen are these neat borders on the side. These are called overlays, which is basically just throwing a static image on top of the screen. The Game Boy Advance one here has a neat little detail where it adds a light shadow on the edge, mimicking the shadow that was cast on the screen of a GBA. And that's everything for the very old retro consoles. Now, let's move up a few console generations and talk about the N64. Emulating the N64. Emulating the N64 is a bitch. And the emulation scene for it is kind of ass. To make a long story short, the N64 uses a lot of microcode to get certain games to look how they do, so emulating N64 is not the easiest thing in the world. On top of this, the N64 emulation scene is scattered and is basically a hack job. I'd love to use some shaders and make N64 games look like an old school TV, but after hours of research and to make a second long story short, it turns out I can't use shaders at all on my Metroid Pocket 5, because N64 emulation sucks ass. Sometimes I'll use a CRT overlay for N64 games, but as you can see with the Smash footage, it can make the game look too dark. I haven't found the right overlay to make N64 games look good yet. So instead, I've decided to upscale the resolution to 1080p. This makes the games look nice and crisp and not a blurry mess. A CRT shader would help disguise the low resolution, but sadly that's not an option. This upscaling technique is what I do for most 3D based consoles. By upping the resolution of GameCube and PS2 to 3 times the original, games are displayed in about a 1080p, and it makes 3D graphics look nice and crisp. Combine this with some widescreen hacks, and some of these games look like straight up remasters. I love to do CRT shaders on some of these games, just to see what they would look like, but the emulators I use for these don't support them, or if they do, I have no idea how to use them. But when it comes to games with more 3D graphics, I think I'd prefer to see them in higher resolution. It may not be authentic, but some of these games are so modern that it seems a bit reductive to add filters that would essentially make these games look worse. See, the point of using CRT filters in the first place isn't for the games to just be authentic. In some ways, they look straight up better. The games were designed with the CRT in mind. The PS2 era of gaming was on the cusp of HD, just a few years away from LCD flat screen TVs becoming way more mainstream. While the GameCube and Xbox are retro in the fact that these consoles were released nearly 25 years ago, those games have more in common with modern games that are being released today than they do with games released just a few years before it. After all, there's abundance of games that were released in this era that have already got official remasters. Because of this, I prefer to just remaster them myself using emulation, rather than adding filters or rendering them at older resolutions. So you got all of our emulators up and running and looking almost identical to what they used to be. But there's another key aspect to experiencing games as authentically as possible, and that's the controllers. For home consoles, to capture that feeling, I have a few controllers I use depending on the console. The easiest option is to use Nintendo's official controllers that they sell. Unfortunately, I find them to be a bit overpriced. Like, I'm gonna spend $50 on a single N64 controller? Psh! I'm gonna spend $70 instead! Why? So, I found some decent alternative options compared to Nintendo's official offerings, and some are even better than what they offer. For example, I've got this 8BitDo SN30 Pro, which is a Bluetooth controller that looks and feels almost identical to an SNES controller, except with additional buttons and sticks. I still have a real SNES controller, and honestly they feel pretty damn close. I also still have all of my controllers from the SNES and up, so why not get some extra use out of them? I have an overabundance of GameCube controllers that I've had since the GameCube came out nearly 25 years ago. It really hurt to say out loud. So, I took my ugliest, most worn down GameCube controller and gave it new life. I took it apart, cleaned it up, and replaced the PCB with 8BitDo's Bluetooth mod kit. And now I can play it wirelessly on basically anything. But I f***ed up soldering the rumble, so now the rumble doesn't work. Oops. I did something similar with an N64 controller. Well, not the up the soldering part. The replacing the PCB part. I have 4 classic N64 controllers, but they're actually all in pretty good condition. So instead of taking those apart, I lived my childhood dream and bought myself an atomic purple controller off of Amazon for 30 bucks and modded that one. Came out wonderful. It even shows up as an N64 controller on the Switch too. The neat thing about this mod kit is that it comes with a Hall effect joystick. So if I wanted to, I can replace the shitty N64 analog stick with this one. Yeah, oh my god, this feels identical to a GameCube joystick. Same thing with the GameCube one. The GameCube mod kits also came with these Hall effect joysticks, so I've actually put them on there as well. Now for the Wii, I still got working Wiimotes and a couple of nunchucks, so all I needed to do was buy the Mave Flash Dolphin bar and connect it to Dolphin. It's a bit finicky, and for some reason some of my controllers constantly disconnect, but otherwise a decent solution for me. For any classic Sega games, I decided to grab this 8BitDo M30. Man, I really am a simp for 8BitDo, huh? Or is it 8-bit? Oh. Anyways, I think the M30 is a nice merger of Genesis and Saturn controllers. I don't plan on playing too many games from these generations, and besides, buying a controller from each generation would start to rack up in my already excessive spending on controllers. See, the reason I have all of these controllers for Nintendo in particular, besides the fact that it's the consoles I grew up with, is because each console has a unique control scheme. Playing most N64 games with a modern controller just feels wrong. There was no second stick, and modern controllers don't have 6 face buttons like the N64 does. If I want to get as close as possible to the authentic N64 experience, I have to use an N64 controller. Sadly, modern knockoffs just don't quite cut it. And this is the case for most Nintendo consoles. GameCube's button layout doesn't translate one-to-one with modern controllers either. Just ask any Smash Bros. Fan. And of course, I'm going to need a Wiimote to play Wii games. I need the M30 for that 6-button layout for Saturn games. And SN30 Pro is great for games that rely exclusively on D-pad focused games, like both the SNES and NES. Compare these with PlayStation and Xbox controllers, which have been more or less following the same shape and button layout for over 25 years. I mean, if it ain't broke. Although I do own PS2 and PS3 and Xbox controllers, I don't think I'm planning on buying any adapters or any alternatives for emulating them. I'm just going to use a modern Xbox One controller and a PS5 controller to fit those consoles. It would be kinda nice to use an OG 360 or PS2 controller for nostalgia's sake, but I honestly don't get any benefit. For the most part, their modern counterparts do everything the old controllers already do, but better. It's the same logic I use for games in the PS2 and Xbox era. I don't want to make my authentic experience to make playing these games feel shittier. I want them to feel right. What that is to me might be different from you, and that's okay. Now, for handheld consoles like the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance, I want to maintain that the authentic experience. I want to feel like I'm playing a Game Boy. These games are meant to be played on small screens, so I want something that would capture that feeling. So remember way earlier how I said I want to talk about 2 retro handhelds? Well, the other retro handheld that I use to coexist with my Metroid Pocket 5 is the Anbernic 35XXSP, contender for the shittiest name award. Thanks. This console looks almost identical to the original Game Boy Advance SP. It's not a perfect replica, it's a bit bigger, thicker, and cheaper feeling than the original. But it's got a bigger, brighter screen and can emulate portable consoles up to the DS no problemo. The specifics are different since the screen's resolution is smaller, but I use all of the same tricks as I mentioned before. I got integer scaling to get that perfect pixel ratio, filters to look like an actual Game Boy screen, and additionally I use a nice overlay that makes it feel like a Game Boy screen. It truly captures the feeling of playing Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games. Now, finally, for the trickiest consoles to emulate, the dual screen ones. I'm currently considering hacking my 3DS to be able to stream my screen onto my computer and capture footage that way. I know it's possible. This is probably the most optimal way to experience DS and 3DS since monitors don't use 3D anymore, sadly, and to maintain the ability to use the touchscreen as Nintendo had intended. At the time of this recording, I haven't actually done it yet, but when I do, maybe I'll make a video on it. For now, casually, I've been emulating these consoles on my RP5 no problem. While it doesn't have dual screens, it does have a touchscreen, so I've been making do with what I have. Now for the other dual screen console, the Wii U. And I know what you're probably thinking. What the hell is a Wii U? Well, it's a Nintendo home console that came out before the Switch that about 2 of us bought. And this bad boy had a tablet controller. Some games utilize this controller in interesting ways, so standard emulation isn't gonna cut it if I want that authentic experience. And if you could guess, emulating the Wii U may have been the trickiest of them all. While I could just play the remasters of these games that were released on the Switch, this isn't always the most viable option. Some games never got ported, most famously the Wind Waker and Twilight Princess HD remakes. In my opinion, these are the definitive way to play these games, not just because of the better resolution, but because of streamlined mechanics and because of that extra screen. So, if I want to experience the Wii U as authentically as possible, I'm going to need that second tablet screen. So I did something ambitious. I took my Metroid Pocket 5 and turned it into a Wii U gamepad. This process was a pain in the ass, and it took me hours to get it to work. However, it turned out the solution was simpler than I thought. I used 2 open source programs called Sunshine and Moonlight to achieve the dual screen gameplay. I installed Sunshine on my PC, which establishes it as the host PC. Then I installed Moonlight on the RP5 to connect it to my PC. And bada bing bada boom! I can play Splatoon 1 with full gyro controls and a working touchscreen. It was a pain, but it was absolutely worth it. And with that, to cows and bulls, my emulation setup is complete. I've got some missing consoles, like the really old stuff, and if I want to play arcade games, I'll probably need to buy an arcade stick at some point, but besides that, it's all good to go. Some of these steps really make a huge difference. Donkey Kong Country never looked better with CRT filters on. Game Boy Advance games just feel right on a smaller handheld, and using a real N64 controller makes that Rumble Pack hit the right spot. And sometimes, nothing beats using the real thing. Now that I've spent all those painful hours, I can finally start playing the games now. Wait, I can play games on this thing? Oh, sweet! Hey, if you made it to the end here, thank you so much for watching. It's the first video I made here on this channel, and it took a lot of work. I didn't really plan on making this video so long, but I wanted to be as thorough as possible. Since I'm just starting out, pressing the old like and subscribe buttons would really help out the channel here. I want to make more content like this, where I go over emulation and retro games and such. If you want to see more of me, I've got a Twitch channel, a clip channel, a VOD channel, social media, and Discord all linked below. And if you want to support me directly, I've got some merch over at epiclootsllc.com. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time, cattle. Bye-bye.